everyone. I am Dr. Pooja Malya. I work as an associate consultant in Majumdar Shaw Medical Center. I am sure all of you must be expecting Dr. Sunil Bhatt. Sir is actually my colleague and he's unfortunately not able to make it to this meeting. He will definitely try in if he can log in. So I welcome everyone to this PHO session. We have a very important topic today, which is one of the very basic topics which all of us need to know. And we have two esteemed speakers. We have Dr. Jyoti, who works as an assistant professor in St. John's Medical College here in Bangalore. And we have Dr. Pooja, who is an associate professor here in Indira Gandhi Institute of Child Health in Bangalore. So they'll be covering about charting chemotherapy. Dr. Jyoti will be covering the basics of the charting of chemotherapy agents. And then we have a question answer round, which Dr. Pooja will take, and a quiz, which she has done for all the fellows and the consultants. I would request all of you to actively participate in this session. All over to you, Jyoti. You could start the talk, please. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Firstly, I'd like to thank IAP PHO for providing me with this opportunity, and special thanks to my teacher mentor, Dr. Anand Prakash, for helping me through this presentation. And I'd like to thank Dr. Pooja for accepting the invite to participate in this presentation. So I'd like to proceed with the presentation, and the layout of today's presentation.
Ma'am, you can stop and restart the screen share if it's stuck. Yes, ma'am, we can see it now. You're muted, ma'am.
Thank you. So, the layout of today's presentation will include the definition and purpose of a chemotherapy charting guideline, followed by detailed description of the various steps involved in chemotherapy charting. And finally, we will have case study based discussions on drug specific precautions that need to be taken while charting chemotherapy. So to begin with, chemotherapy charting is a process of administering the drug to a child with cancer, involving the 6 important steps. Firstly, the document management. Second is prescribing. Third, dispensing of the drug. Preparation and administration of the drug, followed by disposal and monitoring for errors. So a chemotherapy charting standard refers to one that explains the minimum requirements for prescribing, dispensing, and administering of medicines to ensure maximum patient safety. The key persons involved are the patient, the prescriber, who's the document manager, the pharmacist, who's the dispenser, the nurse, who's often the one who prepares and administrates the drug, as well as a quality assessor. Poor is human, we all know that, but such an error in the setting of clinical oncology can cost us a lot, both because of the nature of disease, where underdosing can lead to poor control of cancer, as well as overdosing of, as well as the nature of drugs, wherein overdosing can cause severe side effects, some of which can be fatal. So while administering chemotherapy, it's very important to avoid errors and optimize patient safety. So the incidence of medication errors in oncology practice can vary anywhere between less than 1% to as high as 40%. And most commonly, errors happen in the prescribing phase and the preparation phase. Why is chemotherapy charting error prone in the first place? This is because the scheduling of chemotherapeutic agents is always very complex. The nomenclature is varied. There are several abbreviations for chemotherapeutic agents like CDDP and CDBDA for cisplatin and carboplatin. Several acronyms for especially the protocols. The dosages are variable. While some agents are dispensed as international units, for example, bleomycin or L-asparagine, some are measured in micrograms like actinomycin, and some are measured in milligrams. This, along with the complexity of calculations, some are body surface area based, some are AUC based, some are age based, and all this leads to more errors in chemotherapy charting. So coming to the first step of chemotherapy charting is the document management. Before making a treatment plan, it is imperative that we have a summary of the patient's history, examination, and investigation records to obtain a consent form before we initiate therapy, and an ethics approval if the protocol is a trial protocol. And then we need to prepare an individualized treatment plan. We cannot just take a flowchart from a protocol that's already existing for a child. So every child requires an individual treatment plan. And based on the treatment plan, orders on order sheets will be written or printed. So there are several guidelines dictating the need for specific parameters to be complete in framing a treatment plan. And these guidelines are basically those from Australia, which are the COSA guidelines, the ASCO guidelines, and the UK guidelines. So I have taken the liberty of dividing the treatment plan into 4 parts to make it easy for the audience to understand. So the first part basically involves the patient details, including allergies and comorbidities of the patient, a medical diagnosis, which is complete with staging and risk group information, the name of the protocol and a reference source to support the use of the protocol, as well as a treatment schema. This is a dummy schema, which probably is used for majority of solid tumors. These are examples of other schema. This is the Icicle 1 protocol. It's a beautiful schema, as well as the Interfin 2006 protocol, which has made such a complex scheduling so easy and understandable. The second part is to put down a scheduling of each phase of the entire course of chemotherapy. So there will be different cycles in a full course of chemotherapy. We go to the individual cycle that is meant for the patient at that point in time. So we will have to describe that particular phase. It is recommended to use diagrams so that it makes it easy for the person who is administering chemotherapy to understand the flow of medications in a child. So this again is a dummy scheduling of a single cycle of chemotherapy where 4 different chemotherapeutic agents delivered at different time points and at different dosages are mentioned. So this is an example again from the Interfin 2006 protocol where the scheduling of drugs in a single phase is pictorially represented. Coming to the third part, this looks at parameters that need to be fulfilled before initiating the cycle of chemotherapy that needs to be administered at a certain time point. For example, if a child is due for high dose methotrexate, we first mention the requirements or the prerequisites before proceeding to chemotherapy. For example, for a child who requires high dose methotrexate, we look at the neutrophil count, we look at renal functions, we look at liver functions, and if it fulfills the criteria that is mentioned, we proceed with the cycle that is to be given. It may be worthwhile to prepare a drug-specific checklist and put it on the bulletin board in the chemotherapy preparing room, so that it gives us a way to double check the risk of an error and eliminate any errors if at all. So for example, here among the Vinca alkaloids, when blastin requires blood counts, anthracyclines will require a screening echo. Oxazephrins, that's the cyclophosphamide and ifosfamide, would require renal function tests and specific gravity along with blood counts. Dacarbazine and other alkylating agents will again require blood counts. Cisplatin and carboplatin would require a GFR scan preferably to assess the renal functions, along with electrolytes and hearing assessment for the cisplatin compound. Bleomycin again is specific in its need for a screening pulmonary function test or DLCO, especially if the child has respiratory symptoms. Next, coming to part 4. Part 4 basically describes the cycle. For example, the consolidation phase of AML, cycle 3, high dose Aracy. So this is going to describe the cycle with the date of administration written and anthropometric measurements provided. It may also be important to add age and GFR, because this is required for intrathecal and other dosing, other chemotherapy dosings, which I will be describing in detail subsequently. Next, coming to part 5, this is where we describe the chemotherapy and supportive medications. So the name of the drug, route of the drug, route of administration of the drug, the diluent and its volume, and the rate at which the drug is administered, the frequency and sequence. All of this are going to be mentioned in part 5A. 5B will include supportive therapy. That includes pre-medication, pre-fluids, post-medication orders, which include chemoprotectants like Mesna or leucovorin. So this again is a dummy illustration of part 5, where the chemotherapy, details of chemotherapy are given with pre-fluids and pre-medication mentioned before the chemotherapy and post-chemotherapy medications mentioned after chemotherapy. So we need to know what the appropriate diluents for different chemotherapeutic agents are. In normal saline, 5% dextrose water are the common diluents. We all know that cisplatin typically requires normal saline, while oxaliplatin and liposomal anthracyclines usually use 5% dextrose as the vehicle. And L-asparginase, either of them can be used for IV medication, but for an intramuscular route, NS is preferred. Historically, carboplatin was always administered in 5% dextrose, but now we have enough evidence to state that the decomposition of carboplatin into cisplatin is less than 1% in normal saline at 24 hours, and therefore can be given in either vehicles. So various drugs have various methods of administration. In the IV route, some can be given as a push, some of them are given as intermittent infusions, and some are given as continuous infusions. Many drugs can be given in all 3 types of intravenous techniques. Some alkylating agents like dacarbazine, topoisomerase inhibitors like etoposide are frequently given as short infusions. What we need to remember from this slide is that apart from the way an IV medication is given, we also need to know the concentration at which a medication has to be given. Specifically for etoposide, it has to be around 0.2 to 0.4 milligram per ml, exceeding which an anaphylactoid reaction during infusion is possible. Similarly, for bleomycin, the rate of administration should not exceed 1 mg per minute. The next commonly asked question is, how do we decide on the volume of the diluent? This is very simple. The volume of the diluent depends on the maximum maintenance IV fluid rate per hour multiplied by the number of hours we want to give the infusion. For example, if a child weighing 10 kgs has to be given chemotherapy in a diluent, the IV fluid maintenance rate will be 40 ml per hour. And if the infusion has to go for over 4 hours, we multiply 40 with 4 and we get a diluent volume of 160. Normally, the diluent volume should not exceed this, except in conditions where we require hyperhydration. For example, methotrexate infusion, cisplatin infusion. We commonly require hyperhydration, and in such scenarios, the IV fluid rate for calculation can be 1.5 times the maintenance, which will be 60 ml per hour for a 10 kg child. 10 kg child. Coming to the dosing of chemotherapeutic agents, this is a very important aspect of chemotherapy charting, because the entire protocol depends on the dose we choose and how we choose to dose a particular chemotherapeutic agent. The most common method of dosing is based on body surface area. Mosteller's formula is the commonly used method. Du Bois is another formula that is used for BSA calculation. This we have all seen. This is the West nomogram, where a straight line joining the height and weight will point towards the accurate body surface area. This is another body surface area chart, which predominantly depends on the body weight. This is the CCLG chart. However, there are some important rules we need to remember when charting a drug based on body surface area. We need to know that body surface area calculated dose is inaccurate. 40% of the time, the dose will be incorrect. Approximately 10% patients will be overdosed and 30% of patients will be underdosed when you use the body surface area method to calculate dose. We need to look at certain other parameters to decide what the appropriate drug for the child is. For example, the behavior of the child in a previous chemotherapy cycle that determines the tissue sensitivity of the child. The drug disposition, for example, presence of hypoalbuminemia, presence of third spacing, before we decide on the dose of methotrexate, to know the drug elimination kinetics. If the child who is getting nephrotoxic drugs has impaired creatinine, we need to modify the drugs based on the renal function test, so forth and so on. So we need to understand that body surface area calculation is inaccurate, but we still use it for because we do not have any other method which is superior to body surface area. Body surface area dosing in amputees again. This is an area which does not have evidence-based literature. However, several units use different methods, and it is usually protocol dependent. For example, some would like to use post-surgical weight to determine body surface area post-amputation. Others would want to use the rule of nines like we use in Burns medicine as a way to estimate the body surface area that is that can be deleted from the pre-amputation body surface area. Also, we can determine the percentage of body weight or percentage of body surface area to be deleted from the original calculations. What about dosing in obese children? Using actual body weight regardless of obesity status is what is recommended as of now. Usage of ideal body weight has no evidence because the rate of the incidence of myelosuppression and the degree of myelosuppression is the same irrespective of obesity status, and reduced doses in obese children can lead to poor overall survival. So the recommendation is to use the actual body weight in obese children. What about dosing in infants? In infants, we commonly use the rule of 30. Rule of 30 means that if I shall explain this with an example. For example, if the dose of cytarabine is 100 mg per meter square, we divide the value 100 by 30. So this gives us a number 3.33. This number has to be multiplied by the weight of the child to give us the dose of cytarabine required for that particular child. Dosing based on body surface area in infants often leads to overestimation of the dose, because body surface area in infants is significantly higher the ratio of body surface area to body weight is significantly higher in infants as compared to older children. The other way to go about this is using a thumb rule of less than 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and beyond 12 months, where 2/3, 3/4, and full doses are used. Age-based dosing. This is specific to intrathecal chemotherapy. This is because the CSF volume has a good correlation with age rather than weight of the child. CSF volume often reaches 70% of adult volumes by 3 years of age, and therefore beyond 3 years of age, all children, irrespective of their weight, get the highest the doses mentioned for a 3-year-old. GFR based dosing again is commonly used for carboplatin. The criteria that I have mentioned, height, creatinine, gender, age, and weight, these are important factors responsible to determine GFR in adults. However, in children, using Schwartz formula to determine the height and creatinine, Schwartz formula to determine GFR based on height and creatinine alone is sufficient. So GFR will be calculated based on height and creatinine. The carboplatin dose will be calculated using the modified Calvert formula, which again is based on GFR and AUC, area under curve. Area under curve basically means the change in plasma concentration with time on the x-axis. So like I said, the first step is to calculate GFR. The ideal method to calculate GFR would be to get a GFR scan, either DTPA or EDTA scans. If not, the bedside Schwartz formula, like I mentioned, can be used. The Calvert formula, which is often modified in children, will be used to calculate the carboplatin dose, which is a product of AUC and GFR. Coming to the sixth part of a typical treatment plan would be alerts. So there are a few alerts that need to be mentioned on the treatment plan. Alerts like equations that are required to calculate doses, drug interactions, for example, interactions of methotrexate with other drugs, drug radiation interactions, for example, anthracycline, actinomycin D, percentage of doses that need to be given in the first 6 weeks following chest or abdominal RT. Also, an alert should be mentioned regarding ceiling doses and cumulative doses. Cumulative doses specifically in relapse protocols, where a drug of the same group may be used in the relapse protocol. Example of ceiling doses are around 2 mg for vincristine, 2 to 2.5 mg for actinomycin D, and 30 units for bleomycin. Cumulative doses, we all know this. Cumulative doses for anthracyclines are 450 and 550 milligram per square meter for doxorubicin and daunorubicin respectively. Beyond this cumulative dose, it increases the risk of cardiotoxicity by 10%. Similarly, a cumulative dose of more than 3 grams per meter square in etoposide increases the risk of second malignancies by 3%. And so does nephrotoxicity and neurotoxicity secondary to cisplatin, which increases beyond 600 milligrams per square meter of cisplatin. Another important point I'd like to mention regarding cumulative doses is that we always need to look at the dose per meter square that was given previously instead of looking at an absolute value. For example, if an infant has received daunomycin cumulative dose of 400 milligram per square meter, the absolute value would be something around 150. But we cannot take the 150 milligram as the cumulative dose. We will have to take the 400 milligram as the cumulative dose at the time of calculation. Coming to the last part, this will involve a monitoring protocol, monitoring in terms of clinical examination, in terms of laboratory tests, management of toxicities that have been identified, dose modifications for each agent, and a response assessment sheet. These are the 4 components of the monitoring protocol. This is an example of a methotrexate monitoring sheet on a child who is receiving high dose methotrexate. It includes both clinical and laboratory values. This case study will illustrate the need for describing toxicities and their management. This is about a child who was 3 years old with ovarian germ cell tumor, was taken up for surgery following 3 cycles of PEB-based therapy, that's platinum etoposide and bleomycin-based therapy. She was induced with anesthesia, followed by onset of acute respiratory distress. They could not proceed with surgery, and however, fortunately, the child was stabilized following positive pressure ventilation with 21% oxygen for 24 hours. Post extubation, this child was evaluated with a chest CT, pulmonary function test, and DLCO, and it was suggestive of a grade 3 bleomycin toxicity. This example was quoted to stress on the importance of just not knowing the side effects of chemotherapy, but also sharing information about these side effects with our radiotherapy or surgical colleagues who would also be taking care of a child like we do. Coming to drug modifications, a 10-year-old boy with underlying CKD, secondary to PUV, develops orbital RMS. We plan to give a 3-drug chemotherapy schedule with vincristine, actinomycin, and cyclophosphamide. However, we have concerns about the use of cyclophosphamide with an elevated creatinine value of 2.1. So how do we go about managing this child? It would be useful for us to put up a list in our treatment ward with the drugs and modifications that need to be made based on the existing hepatic function and existing renal function. I will not go through the details of every drug, but however, this is a compilation of all the modifications that need to be made for different drugs in the presence of hepatic dysfunction as well as renal dysfunction. So for this particular child, in the presence of renal dysfunction, we need to calculate the eGFR, and if it is less than 10 ml per minute, we need to give only 50% of the full dose. And based on the treatment plan, looking at the drugs and the schedule on the treatment plan, we document the same medications on the order sheet present in the child's file. Several institutes use pre-printed order sheets with an intent to minimize errors, and studies have shown that pre-printed order sheets minimize errors by a margin of 75%. Also, a supportive care sheet, that is the chlorhexidine mouthwash, candid mouth paint, and anti-fungal prophylaxis, antibacterial prophylaxis the child is on, will all have to be mentioned in a different sheet separate from the chemotherapy sheet. So this is the ideal way of documenting orders on the order sheet. So with this, we finish the first step in chemotherapy charting and the most important step in chemotherapy charting. I will now proceed with chemotherapy prescriptions. Could the symbol on the left is the prescription symbol. Would anyone from the audience be able to identify the symbol on the right? Sorry, I don't have access to the chat box. Are there any answers?
No, please answer. Yes.
So this is the Eye of Horus. It's an Egyptian symbol which stands for health and prosperity, and it is usually printed on the pyramids to ensure good health of the pharaoh in his afterlife. So that's how we get the prescription symbol. So this trivia apart, let's proceed with the components of correct prescription writing. We all know that it includes 5 important components. So this is an example of a reasonably good prescription, which has a superscription having the details of the child, the diagnosis of the child, and the prescription symbol, and then we have the inscription and transcription, which is the drug form, the name of the drug, and the dose, followed by how exactly it has to be given, including how many times in a day, the time at which it has to be given, and for how many days in a week or a month. This has to be mentioned clearly. The number 30 is what we call the subscription. This is for the pharmacy to decide on an estimate of number of medications that need to be dispensed. And finally, the signature of the prescriber has to be mentioned. I have put this up to focus on common errors in writing down a prescription. In comparison to what I just displayed, this is a prescription which is hardly any close to the previous prescription. It is clearly illegible. The anthracycline here, I'm not even sure if it's an anthracycline, but it looks like either doxorubicin or donorubicin. So this will cause a lot of confusion in giving a good, I mean, it will not let the pharmacist to dispense the drug confidently. Using abbreviations like VP16 for etoposide is not acceptable. Using punctuations inappropriately. So when we give 100.0, this punctuation and the 0 is totally unnecessary. And this will lead to confusion. It will lead to the pharmacist to think that this is about 1000 milligrams and dispense the wrong quantity. So this is exactly what we should not do while prescribing drugs to a child who requires chemotherapy. How to avoid prescription errors? Make sure that the prescription is legible, because bad readability leads to 50% of prescription errors. LASA drugs, LASA drugs are look-alike, sound-alike drugs, preferably need to be written based on the tall man lettering technique, where the part of the name which sounds similar has to be written in block letters and has to be written in taller letters as compared to the rest of the drug. Do not use decimals unnecessarily, and do not cause decimal placement confusion. Avoid abbreviations. Avoid crossing up, crossouts, and overwriting. When prescribing frequency, it would be ideal to specify times so that it's easier for the patient to plan his medication intake. Also, consideration needs to be given to the cost, and avoid unnecessary drugs to keep the prescription simple. A note on CPOE. This is computerized physician order entry, where it's a process of electronic entry of medications by the medical practitioner. It aims at reducing, it has led to reduction in errors by 2/3. So this is a computer-based physician order rather than a handwritten order. Next, coming to chemotherapy dispensing, I will be investing the least amount of time on this, because errors are least common while dispensing. We just need to know two important things. One is the cold chain and one is segregation. There are a few drugs like vincristine or L-asparginase, or drugs we give in the ABVD protocol, the bleomycin and dacarbazine, which all need to be transported at a temperature of 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. After dispensing the drug from the pharmacy, when the patient walks around the campus to reach the OPD and then goes to the ward to receive his medications, it's clearly no cold chain. Also, we need to pay attention to segregation, where non-chemotherapeutic agents are given in a separate package compared to the chemotherapeutic agents. And among chemotherapy agents, intrathecal medications have to be dispensed separately in a separate package, in a separate container, must be received separately by the nurse and stored in a separate container. We will come to the reason as to why this separate transport of intrathecal therapy is important. This is a picture of an innovative method used by one of the pharmacists in our ward, where he's used a white ice gel pack to transport L-asparginase in an attempt to maintain cold chain. Also, we can use vaccine carriers and cold boxes to maintain the cold chain. I have already mentioned about the the way intrathecal drugs have to be dispensed. We will come to the whys of it subsequently. So the next step, the fourth step, is chemotherapy preparation. I will be talking about the biosafety cabinet and laminar flow, personal protective equipment, and errors we commit during loading of medications and dose calculations. So biosafety cabinet is a ventilated enclosure which protects the user, the product, and the environment from aerosols arising from the handling of hazardous substances. So how exactly does this ventilated enclosure protect all three components? The first component is the person preparing chemotherapy. The second component is the chemotherapeutic agent itself. And the third component is the environment in which this preparation is happening. So this is a picture of a biosafety cabinet class 2 type 2B. We do not need to know the details of why it is classified as type 2B, but we need to know how exactly this functions. So when a nurse is sitting in front of the cabinet, air is always moving in the inward direction. It runs under the worktop and moves posteriorly towards the plenum. So the green is the inward air, the red is the contaminated inward air that is not going to contaminate equipment placed in the cabinet, and it is moving underneath the worktop and behind the worktop to reach the filter. The filter can be of two types, a HEPA filter and ULPA filter. HEPA filter, the air that is filtered by the HEPA filter is directed towards the exhaust, and that will go to the environment. And the ULPA, that is ultra low particulate air filter, will be directing this air, which is now clean and free of aerosols, to move in a vertical laminar flow and circulate within the cabinet where all the chemotherapy equipment and drugs are placed. So the inward movement of air prevents any outward simultaneous outward movement, because this is all laminar flow, it is not turbulence. So there is movement of air only in one direction. So the inward airflow protects the nurse who is preparing chemotherapy. The HEPA filtered air, which is moving away from the exhaust, is preventing any aerosols from going into the environment and protects the environment from aerosols. And the blue colored downward laminar airflow will keep the chemotherapeutic agents and chemotherapy equipment free from contamination. So this is exactly how a biosafety cabinet functions in protecting all three aspects of preparation. There are standard operating procedures for usage of biosafety cabinet. We do not need to know the details of these. We just need to know that it needs to be cleaned and exposed to germicidal UV light at least for 30 minutes, after which it is re-cleaned again. After use, the chamber has to be cleaned again to eliminate any spillage, and again exposed to germicidal UV light. Two important general instructions we need to know is that when the nurse is working with the equipment and drugs that are placed in the cabinet, the shutter is never lifted beyond midway, following which an alarm goes off and the procedure has to be stalled. Also, when the UV light is on, we should never open the shutter. The operational procedure is simple. We have to assemble all materials in advance before initiating preparation, because if we find some equipment or material missing midway during the procedure, we will have to take off the personal protective equipment and redo the entire procedure all over again. So make sure we assemble all materials before starting preparation. Workflow must always be from the clean to contaminated area, and arm movements must always be in and out instead of side to side motion. Preparation of drugs will also require the nurse or the doctor who's preparing medications to wear protective gear and protective clothing. During preparation, it may be worthwhile to have a list of important conversions, so that while preparing, it does not cause too much anxiety in the nurse who is preparing it. So it's worthwhile to have a list of conversions on a bulletin board close to the biosafety cabinet. For example, many drugs which are given subcutaneously are often given using an insulin syringe. The orders usually will mention how many ml of the drug should be given, and the nurse will find it difficult to convert this into insulin units and administer, leading to errors. We should remember that the nursing staff, the pharmacists, are not mathematicians, and they have more important things to do rather than calculating medication volumes. So it would be ideal for us to have these conversions, printed sheets of conversions on a bulletin board close to the biosafety cabinet. This is again a case study. This is what we typically see in the ward. The nurses are given this order. It states 40 mg of cisplatin to be mixed in 250 ml of IV fluids and run at 10 ml per hour. This is fairly straightforward. However, it also states that we need to concurrently run IV fluids in 500 ml of DNS containing 6 grams of mannitol, 10 millimoles of KCl, 4 milliequins of magnesium sulfate, and 3 milliequins of calcium gluconate. So the nurse is now supposed to perform 4 different calculations. She needs to know how many ml contains 6 grams of mannitol and KCl and magnesium sulfate and so on. So it would be ideal to have an electrolyte solution chart such as this, which will ease conversion. Or even better, we can have this chart fixed in the protocol sheet or the treatment plan sheet, and the doctor, doctor himself calculates the ml that is to be mixed in 500 ml of IV fluid. So we'd rather have the ml on the right written rather than the units mentioned on the left. It would be easier to say 30 ml, 5 ml, 1 ml, and 6 ml instead of the units given on the left. So coming to chemotherapy administration, the most important step in chemotherapy administration is to inform the patient before administration. That is pre-administration counseling. Following this, I will be talking about routes of administration and sequence of administration. The first thing is we need to have a written and oral, we need to write and orally inform the overview of treatment process and the side effects to expect following a chemotherapy cycle. Also, home care and home management has to be explained to the patient, and a contact point must be given in case of an emergency for them to contact. So chemotherapy administration routes, these are the common chemotherapy administration routes. IV route, most commonly used, can be given as bolus, intermittent or continuous infusions. The intramuscular route is commonly used for L-asparginase administration. These are the various sites that can IM injections can be given. Subcutaneous injections the site of subcutaneous injections has to be changed on a daily basis and do not give on the same site. Coming to intrathecal administration, there have been many reports about fatal accidents when a drug not meant for intrathecal administration is mistakenly given instead of a drug meant for intrathecal administration. And we all know the classical example of this is vincristine, which causes fatal ascending radiculomyeloencephalopathy. Apart from the wrong identification of drug, other common errors are the dilution of these drugs, where strengths usually exceed 1 mg per ml, which is not advisable. Also, triple agents are given separately instead of mixing them in one syringe, and not training the parents to let the child lie supine position 1 hour post procedure. These are the common mistakes that happen during intrathecal administration. Coming to the management of drip rates of infusions, this is very important because in resource limited settings where we do not have electronic pumps, we need to know how to manually fix drip rates. So the manual drip sets are micro and macro drip sets, which are gravity assisted drip sets. And we also have automated infusion sets, which are volumetric and syringe pumps. Volumetric and syringe pumps are not commonly used in resource limited settings because it is both expensive and it requires expertise, both of which are lacking in some parts of the country. So the lifesaver for most of us would be the yellow color wheat tracking controller that most of us commonly use to set drip rates. Also, we need to know this differences between the infusion pump and syringe pump so that we know when to use a syringe pump and when to use an infusion pump. A syringe pump is an advanced version of infusion pump. However, it cannot give more than 50 ml of fluid, and therefore it is used for indications where the rate of flow of the IV fluid is very slow, like about 5 ml per hour, typically used in infants or used in extremely cytotoxic drugs. So now we come to the actual management of drip rates. So I will go through the steps of managing drip rates. The first step is to choose the right IV tubing. If the child is receiving a flow rate of more than 100 ml per hour, we use the macro drip set. And if they use a flow rate of less than 100 ml per hour, we use the micro drip set. The next is to identify the drip factor. What is drip factor? We all know that a micro drip set, it takes 60 drops to make 1 ml, and in a macro drip set, it takes 22 drops to make 1 ml. However, the macro drip sets have different calibrations, and the drip factors are often differently calibrated. So we always have to look at the package, but in most places, it is usually calibrated as drip rate is calibrated at 20. That means it takes 22 drops of IV fluids to form 1 ml. So this is the drip factor. And finally, how do we calculate the drip rate? The drip rate is nothing but total volume of fluid to be given divided by total time over which it is given into the drip factor. So this is an example. This is a question. An 8-year-old boy weighing 25 kgs requires half DNS to be infused at 120 ml per hour. The IV tubing set is a macro drip set. So I look at the calibration and it says 15 drops per minute. How do I calculate the drip rate? Could I get any answers from the audience, please? Sorry, I have no access to the chat box. Are there any answers as yet?
No answers, Dr. Jyoti.
So it is 120 ml divided by 60 minutes. That is, that gives us a value of 2, and this has to be multiplied by the drip factor, which is 15. So 2 into 50 is 30 drops per minute. So this is how we set the drip rate. There are lots of newer paraphernalia which can help us improve the way we infuse drugs. For example, the image on the left is a drum flow regulator. There is also a dial flow regulator, where you just have to look at the number and fix the IV fluid rate that is required. It's slightly more expensive compared to a regular tubing set. And also the Y side for giving more than 2 compatible infusions at the same time. These are extension wires and 3-ways, which again, extension sets and 3-ways, which again help us improvising the way IV infusions are given. Finally, coming to oral chemotherapy, more and more oral chemotherapy is now used because of the introduction of targeted therapy, differentiating agents like cis-SATRA or cis-retinoic acid and all-trans retinoic acid, metronomic therapy for advanced diseases. Oral chemotherapy is certainly now a very important part of chemotherapy. But the flip side of this is that though it is easy, the responsibility now lies on the caretaker, and errors of both omission and commission are common because it occurs in the home environment, which is not monitored or noticed by medical personnel. And the most important step to improve adherence in oral chemotherapy is education, education, and education. We need to tell the patient in simple language the purpose of the drug, how to take the drug. We should encourage them to learn drug names and review their understanding of the medications. It's preferable that we keep treatment regimens simple and avoid unnecessary medications. Otherwise, it becomes difficult for the patient to take n number of medications at home. And we need to call them for follow-up and monitor compliance in the form of tablet count or looking at organ function disturbances. For example, deranged AST and ALT, suggestive of compliance to 6 MP, and therapeutic drug monitoring. These are the ways in which we can monitor compliance. Additional information regarding how to consume the medication can also be given to the patient. Now I request Dr. Pooja to make the subsequent presentation on drug-specific precautions.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti, for that very nice presentation. And I will just share my screen. Is my screen visible now? Is the screen visible? Is the screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank the IIP-PHO chapter for giving me this opportunity. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Jyoti for inviting me for this session. So without further ado, we'll go on to the questions. So first, we have a 3-year-old child who's a case of metastatic neuroblastoma and is on chemotherapy. The child is due to receive cyclophosphamide, etoposide, and platinum. And the order sheet reads this. It says injection cyclophosphamide 400 mg IV in 100 ml NS over 30 minutes. Subsequent to this, the mother notices reddish discoloration of the urine 12 hours after the child receives the drug. So for the students in the audience, as well as the faculty who would also like to participate, can you identify the errors in this particular prescription and what is the diagnosis of the child? I'm sure it's quite a straightforward question, and I'm sure hardly any prescriptions will look like this, but just to drive home the point, we have made this question answer session. So you can please type your answers in the chat box, and Dr. Jyoti will let me know if any of you have typed the ansurs. So just to give you an yes, that's correct.
That's the
so
answer,
just
right?
to give so just to give you an overview of the drug, it is available in varying concentrations from 200 milligram to 2 grams, and it is usually diluted in normal saline. And the final concentration that we want to achieve is 20 milligram per ml, and it remains stable. The vial remains stable for around 48 hours in the fridge and 24 hours in the room temperature. So if you need to give a drug which is a quantity less than 1 gram, you usually dilute it in 100 ml NS, whereas if it's more than 1 gram, it's diluted in 250 ml of NS. So what are the precautions that we need to take before administration of cyclophosphamide? The 2 most important precautions are pre and post hydration, the concentration of the drug that you want to achieve during infusion, as well as use of a chemoprotectant like Mesna for prevention of hemorrhagic cystitis. The other precautions you need to take is that it has to be given in portion with patients with abnormal renal function. Most of the children who receive standard dose or high dose cyclophosphamide can have myelosuppression. Most protocols warrant the use of colony stimulating factor to prevent myelosuppression. And of course, it has a moderate to high risk emetogenic potential. So make sure to use your antiemetics before you are prescribing cyclophosphamide in any child. So what is the rationale for hydration and Mesna? Just to give you a brief view of that. So during hepatic metabolism, as you all know, cyclophosphamide and ifosfamide, there is a toxic compound called acrolein which is generated. This is filtered in the kidneys, it is concentrated in the bladder, and through production of a reactive oxygen species, it causes damage to the uroepithelium. Now what Mesna does is it conjugates with this toxic metabolite acrolein and converts it into the harmless metabolite that can be excreted in the urine. So how do you administer hydration in a child who's receiving cyclophosphamide? So prior to the pre-hydration usually is given at a rate of 200 ml per meter square per hour, which is usually given for about an hour or so. And the urine specific gravity should be around less than 1.010 before cyclophosphamide is begin. After the cyclophosphamide is administered, usually hydration is carried on for a period of 24 hours, and it is given at a rate of 3 liters per meter square. How should Mesna be administered? So now there are varying ways in which Mesna can be administered, and the dose is usually equivalent to 60 to 100% dose of the cyclophosphamide dose that you've calculated. The first way that you can administer Mesna is to give it as an IV bolus. So the first bolus, that is 20% of the dose, is usually of the 60%, the 20% of the dose is given around 15 minutes prior to the cyclophosphamide administration. And the subsequent doses are given at 4 hours and 8 hours after the start of cyclophosphamide. The alternate method is to put the Mesna in the continuous infusion of cyclophosphamide that you are administering and goes along with the cyclophosphamide infusion. And the third way is to combine, either give the first dose as an IV bolus, a 20% dose, and following that, the remaining dose is given at 4 and 8 hours as an oral dose. So to answer the question that was asked, the pre-hydration and post-hydration was not prescribed in that particular order sheet. There was a higher concentration of cyclophosphamide that was coming out to be in the infusion. It was around 40 mg per ml when you'd like it to be around 20 mg per ml, and it should have probably been infused over 1 hour rather than at a faster rate. And the orders for Messner were not mentioned. And like most of you would have answered in the chat box, the child did have a complication of hemorrhagic cystitis. The best way to actually treat hemorrhagic cystitis, do not let it happen. So these would be the precautions that you would need to take to ensure that the child does not have hemorrhagic cystitis, one of the most dreaded complications of cyclophosphamide. So now we come to the second question. Again, a simple one. A 3-year-old girl with hepatoblastoma. She is admitted for her 3rd course of chemotherapy. So she is due to get her IV cisplatin infusion. The doctor, of course, like any good doctor would do, has asked for an input and output monitoring for this child. And her urine output for the last 6 hours is around 250 ml per meter square. So I want to ask the audience, do you think this urine output is adequate? And if not, what do we need to do for improving the urine output? So you can type your answers in the chat box, and Dr. Jyoti can let me know what your answers are. So let's go on. The same chart for cisplatin. So it's available in varying concentrations again, ranging from 10 mg per 10 ml to 50 mg per 50 ml and 100 mg per 100 ml. It is available as a ready solution, so these need not be reconstituted. And when you are administering the drug, it is usually in a concentration of 1 mg per ml. Now, when you are administering the product, if the quantity is less than 60 mg, then you usually can dilute it in 100 ml NS. If it is greater than 60 mg, then 250 ml of NS. And the product remains stable at 24 hours at room temperature. So again, what are the precautions that you want to use before or during administration of cisplatin? Again, pre-hydration and post-hydration to prevent nephrotoxicity. You need to make sure that you are supplementing electrolytes or diuretics which are to be added to the hydration fluid. Very important to monitor the input and output for the patient. It requires dose adjustment and renal function. You have to make sure you're not using any other nephrotoxic drugs like aminoglycoside antibiotics, which are commonly used in these patients. And you have to make sure that the child already does not have a hearing impairment and peripheral neuropathy, which are also known side effects of platinum agents. They have a very high emetogenic potential. So you have to make sure that your anti-emetic protocol has been properly charted so that the child, has a smooth course during her chemotherapy administration and is not very distressed. And you have to avoid aluminum needles because it causes precipitation of the cisplatin. So again, how do you administer the hydration and the electrolytes? So first, I would like to just skip forward and tell you what is the rationale for the hydration and the electrolytes. So if you were to see what happens when the cisplatin is administered IV is, in the plasma, there is a high chloride milieu. So in that high chloride milieu, cisplatin persists as a neutral species, okay? And it enters the cell and it loses its chlorides in the low chloride milieu within the cell. Yes? So just to be sure again, in the plasma, there is a high chloride milieu and it's a neutral species. But when it enters the cell and there is a low chloride milieu, then it becomes activated. Now, what happens if in the urine also there is a low chloride environment, the drug undergoes acquisition or activation and it attacks the nephron and the renal epithelium. So if you don't want acquisition to happen, you have to ensure that the urine volume is adequate and the chloride content is maximized so that the cisplatin remains as a neutral species and does not cause renal damage. You have to know that it damages the distal tubule more than the proximal tubule, and the renal dysfunction can occur after several cycles of chemotherapy, and it can even have a normal serum creatinine. So how do you administer the hydration and the electrolytes in a child who's receiving cisplatin infusion? So the pre-hydration needs to start at least 3 to 4 hours prior with half DNS, and it should be done at 200 ml per meter square per hour. The cisplatin infusion should again be given only in normal saline. And the suggested volume, like Dr. Jyoti said, can be calculated, but this is a rough guide. If you're giving less than 60 mg, 60 ml, 60 to 120 in 120 ml, and more than 120 mg in 240 ml. No other fluids other than sodium chloride should be used, like I said, as a vehicle for cisplatin. Post hydration, it is usually given for 24 hours, again with half DNS. Like I said, you want to encourage diuresis. So you will be adding a mannitol, which is a diuretic, into the post-hydration fluid. You will also be adding other electrolytes which can get depleted during the platinum administration, such as potassium chloride, magnesium sulfate, and calcium gluconate, and you will give the fluid at 125 ml per meter square per hour. So what you need to do again is, like I said, monitor the input and output during administration of each cycle for these children. And if you have a child who's having a urine output which is less than 400 ml per meter square, or less than 3 ml per kg per hour for 2 hours, you give a bolus of mannitol, 0.5 gram per kg over 15 to 30 minutes. And if the child is having persistent vomiting because of, is having persistent vomiting because of the drug, you make sure that you replace that fluid so that, the child is not volume depleted. And usually furosemide is avoided as it is ototoxic also. And mannitol is the drug which is recommended for diuresis. So this is a schema which shows how usually, how complicated it can be. So to minimize it, like Dr. Jyoti said, you can make a schema of how you're going to be administering the drugs, writing specific times, and when the hydration should start, when the infusion should go, and when the post hydration should be going. If you make it a schema, it makes things much easier to follow, both for the staff nurse as well as for the doctor who's going to be monitoring the child. So the urine output for this child was inadequate. It was 250 ml per meter square per hour. So we needed to give mannitol for inducing diuresis in this child. So Dr. Jyoti, were there any answers in the chat box for this particular question?
Yes. There was one answer which said mannitol has to be given. That's good.
So now we come to the third question. A 6-year-old boy with pre-B acute lymphoblastic leukemia is due for his high-dose methotrexate as part of extra compartment therapy. He received bicarbonate-rich pre-fluids overnight with urine pH monitoring, and early morning pH is 6.5. Now, this is, I am sure, a common problem where, mothers and family members are roaming around with urine strips. The urine pH does not seem to budge beyond 6.5, and everybody is worried. So you need to know how to adjust the bicarbonate concentration in fluid. Also, the child is on voriconazole prophylaxis. We will come to the importance of this part, of course, later in this presentation. So methotrexate again is available in varying concentrations, 50 mg per 2 ml to 500 mg per 20 ml or 1 gram per 40 ml, and it's available as a ready solution. And usually, like I will not go into the details of intrathecal administration because that probably will be discussed when methotrexate is being discussed in detail. So I will straight away go to high dose methotrexate and what are the dosage schedules which are available for methotrexate. So high dose is defined as an infusion of 500 mg per meter square or more. Intermediate dose usually between 50 to 100 milligram per meter square, and low dose is less than 50 mg per meter square. So usually when we're administering high dose methotrexate, it is divided into 2 parts. The first part is the, suppose if you're giving a 3 gram per meter square dose, the first part is a bolus dose, which is given over 1 hour or half hour in some protocols. And the second part is an infusion, which is given over the next 23 hours in normal saline. Now, what are the pre-therapy checks that you need to do in case of methotrexate? Of course, you're supposed to check complete blood count, serum creatinine, and liver function tests. You need to give supportive care in the form of hydration, urinary alkalization. You have to monitor clinical parameters as well as lab parameters like methotrexate levels, drug interactions, and leucovorin rescue. So you have to keep, these are the pillars of supportive care for any child who's going to be receiving high dose methotrexate. So again, what is the rationale for hydration and alkalization? So during high dose infusion or when you're giving a high dose methotrexate, the drug is rapidly excreted and it may lead to high methotrexate concentrations in the renal tubular fluid. And methotrexate as well as metabolites, it's a complicated name, 7-hydroxy methotrexate and 4-deoxy-4-amino, so DAMPA for short. They are poorly soluble at an acidic pH. These metabolites as well as methotrexate are poorly soluble at an acidic pH. So what are you trying to do? By increasing the urinary pH from 6 to 7 and beyond, it increases the solubility of methotrexate and its metabolites by 5 to 8-fold. So that is what you're trying to achieve. Now, how will you achieve this? Hydration and alkalization, again, pre-hydration for 3 to 12 hours. It is administered at 125 ml per meter square per hour or 3 liters per meter square per day. Urinary alkalization, the target of your urine pH should be more than 7. So initially, soda bicarb is given, like it's 25 ml is added to a 500 ml IV fluid. And suppose the urinary pH is not, going beyond 7. So what you can do is you can give bolus doses of 12.5 to 25 millicoulombs per meter square if the pH is less than what you want it to be, that is more than 7. And how frequently should you be measuring the urine pH? It should be done usually on an hourly basis, so it's not very practically feasible, but ideally it should be done on an hourly basis, or at least 2 hourly throughout the high dose methotrexate infusion, because sometimes boluses of soda bicarb may need to be given to achieve alkaline urine. So in patients with sometimes with serum alkalosis and inadequate urinary alkalization, you might need to add an adjunct such as a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor like astazolamide, and after that post hydration needs to continue for 24 to 48 hours. So clinical and lab monitoring and folinic acid rescue, you need to do input output monitoring again for these children because it's a nephrotoxic drug. The methotrexate levels need to be done, and folinic acid rescue, which usually starts at 36 hours. I'm not going into the details as to why it starts at 36 hours. That is again for another presentation. But usually between 36 to 42 hours is when the methotrexate, when the folinic acid rescue starts. And the dosage at 36 hours is usually 15 mg per meter square, 36 to 48 hours, again 15 mg per meter square. And from then on, it's given as per this table. Of course, all of you are familiar with this table. So you will look at the methotrexate plasma concentration, which is available to you. And accordingly, you will titrate the folinic acid doses for these children. So what are the clinical parameters? Like I said, urine input and output. And if the child is having fluid overload, or if the urine output is not as you expect, then again, you need to give furosemide in these children. Other parameters which need to be monitored include creatinine, sodium, potassium, and liver function tests. And at least during the coming week, you have to check, these parameters at least twice during the coming week. So the drug interactions, again, extremely important with methotrexate. The most famous one, of course, is your Septran or trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, which is usually stopped a week before in these patients, so that it does not interfere with methotrexate. The others, of course, are NSAIDs, amphotericin B, aminoglycoside antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, P-glycoprotein, and levetiracetam. So, of course, like probably levetiracetam and other essential drugs, you might have to switch to another alternative because they cannot be stopped. But most of the other drugs, you need to stop before you are administering high-dose methotrexate. So the answer to the question, Dr. Jyoti, did anyone mention about bicarbonate boluses in this case?
No.
Okay,
no
so
answers.
this is important for you to understand. Monitoring of urinary pH has to be done, religiously. And if the bicarbonate if the pH is not as expected, you need to give boluses of bicarbonate anywhere between 12.5 to 25 milliequivalents per meter square. And there is no significant interaction between methotrexate and voriconazole. So again, quickly, I think we have time. So the fourth question: a 12-year-old girl with ovarian GCT on PEV protocol, she is admitted for cycle 3, and she has received cisplatin and bleomycin and is due to receive etoposide. And the order sheet reads this: injection etoposide 100 mg IV mixed in 80 ml NS to infuse over 60 minutes. After 10 minutes, after starting the infusion, the child complains of flushing, itching, dizziness. And you need to tell me now, what are the errors in this order sheet and what do you think this particular child is experiencing? So if you can please write your answers in the chat box. So I think the answer to one of the questions is quite evident over here.
Inadequate dilution of etoposide.
That's good. That's good. So that is what I'm expecting. So again, it's usually available. What we commonly use is the 100 mg in 5 ml solution, and it is a readily available solution. And what you need to understand is that this product needs to have a concentration between 0.2 to 0.4 milligram per ml and not more than that. So this is what was the problem with the order sheet. The concentration was higher in this particular question that I gave you. Now, what was this child experiencing? She was experiencing an infusion reaction, a chemotherapy infusion reaction. So what is a chemotherapy infusion reaction? Unexpected reactions that cannot be explained by the known toxicity profile of the drug is what is defined as a chemotherapy infusion reaction. The common agents which are implicated are taxanes, platinum drugs, pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, asparaginase, of course, quite notorious for that, procarbazine, etoposide, bleomycin, and cytarabine. So here we have this child who's receiving etoposide, and during the infusion, she's developed an infusion reaction. So the signs and symptoms can be varied. They can affect any organ system, and most of the reactions that occur are mild in severity. But you should understand that some of them, can be very fatal also. Especially we have seen children with asparaginase infusions or who have received asparaginase who have anaphylaxis. So the reactions, like I said, can range from mild to moderate to very severe. The most common signs and symptoms that most of these children experience are flushing, itching. They can have alterations, heart rate, like they experience palpitations. They say that they have difficulty in breathing. They complain of abdominal pain, chills, and sometimes they can have vomiting, persistent vomiting, the tightening of the throat. In severe cases, they can have seizures also, and sometimes dizziness or syncope. And of course, anaphylaxis in very severe cases where the child lands up with hypotension and shock. So again, there is a grading which is available for infusion-related reactions, which is from grade 1 to grade 2, and finally to grade 5. So grade 1 is a mild transfusion reaction where you need not, interrupt the infusion that you're giving. Grade 2 is you might need an interruption of the infusion, but it promptly responds to symptomatic management. Grade 3, 4, and 5, of course, are severe forms of the reaction. Grade 5 is a reaction where the child may even die of the infusion reaction. So how do you manage? So for mild to moderate, like I already mentioned over here, you might need to interrupt the infusion. You might need to symptomatically manage the child with antihistaminics, with NSAIDs, and IV fluids. But with the anaphylactic reaction, of course, the first thing that you need to do is take care of the airway of the child. You might need to do an emergency intubation or even a cricothyrotomy. And of course, the drug of choice for anaphylaxis is in epinephrine, which you will be administering, which I don't need to go into the details, but 0.01 mg per kg. You have to place the child in recumbent position, give oxygen and a normal saline bolus. There might be some children whose bronchospasm may not respond to your epinephrine, and then you might need to use drugs like albuterol. You can use antihistamines like Avil or diphenhydramine and steroids, and definitely these children need to be under strict monitoring because they can deteriorate at any time. Suppose there are children who have refractory symptoms, then you need to use epinephrine infusion and other vasopressors as well. So this child, like I said, the etoposide concentration should not have exceeded 0.4 mg per ml, and the infusion reaction needed to be managed. He was having a chemotherapy infusion reaction. And now we come to the final question. So here we have a 14-year-old boy with TNHL. He arrives at the daycare for his delayed intensification therapy. He is due to receive vincristine and doxorubicin. His IV line is secure. There is good backflow. He receives his vincristine uneventfully. But during the doxorubicin infusion, the nurse notices that there is a significant swelling in the site proximal to the IV site. So what is your diagnosis and how do you manage this condition? So you can type your answers in the chat box. I know all of these questions are quite simple, but still, for just to play along, I think you can answer, and let me see how many of you can get this right. So let's see. This, of course, is an extravasation reaction. Yeah, extravasation reaction. Now, how do you define an extravasation reaction? So it is an inadvertent infiltration of chemotherapy into the subcutaneous or subdermal tissue surrounding the intravenous or intraarterial administration site that you have used. So extravasated drugs, they can be classified according to their potential for causing damage as vesicant, irritant, and non-vesicant. This is, of course, an exhaustive list, but the common ones that you all know are, of course, the anthracyclines and dactynomycin D and the vinca alkaloids. So these are the ones which are the common culprits most of the time, where children have really bad can have really bad extravasation injuries. So how do you manage? I'm only going to be discussing the management of an extravasation injury in a peripheral site and not going to the details of a central venous access site. So how do you manage an extravasation injury? The first step always is to stop and disconnect the infusion and leave the needle in place. You identify which agent has extravasated. So we know that the vincristine went uneventfully. It is the doxorubicin which is the culprit in this particular situation. You leave the cannula in place and you try and aspirate as much of the extravasated solution as possible and record the volume of whatever fluid you have aspirated in the patient's record. And then you give manual pressure over the extravasated area. You have to remove the cannula. You have to mark that site with a pen, preferably a marker pen, and notify, or well, of course, if you are the treating physician, you have to start the measures immediately. So first you have to identify whether it is a vesicant, irritant, or a non-vesicant. If it's a non-vesicant, you have to just give local dry compresses. Whereas if it's a vesicant or irritant, you have to either localize and neutralize, or you have to disperse and dilute. So which are the agents which you need to localize and neutralize? Anthracycline, dactynomycin, and alkylating agents. Which are the agents which you need to disperse and dilute? It is vinca alkaloids, taxanes, and platin salts. So if you have to localize and neutralize, you have to apply dry cold compresses for 20 minutes, 4 times daily for 1 to 2 days. And neutralizing, you have specific antidotes for anthracyclines. It is topical DMSO and dextroxazone. And for mitomycin C, it is topical DMSO. I'll be coming to the doses later. If you have to disperse, then you have to apply dry warm compresses for 20 minutes, 4 times daily, again for 1 to 2 days, and dilute, administer agents which increase absorption, such as hyaluronidase, which is used in case of vinca alkaloids and taxane. You have to, of course, make sure that you give adequate analgesia to the child and elevate the limb. So how much are you going to give? The cold compresses, I already mentioned how much you're going to give. The dextroxazone, it has to be given over 1 to 2 hours IV in a large vein away from the extravasation area. Okay, it is not to be given in the same area, it is to be given away from the extravasation area at a dose of 1000 mg per meter square within 6 hours. After that, 1000 mg per meter square after 24 hours, and 500 mg per meter square after 48 hours. The DMSO is, of course, topical, and for peripheral line extravasation, if dextroxazone is unavailable or cannot be started within 6 hours, then you use DMSO. You apply a few drops of 50% DMSO at the site using a sterile gauze pad every 8 hours, and you allow it to dry. You do not cover the site, and you do this procedure for 7 days. So that is the end of the question. I now hand over to Dr. Jyoti to finish her part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja, for a good presentation. So resuming from where I stopped, so I will now proceed to the last part of chemotherapy charting. So, disposal of cytotoxic waste. So these are questions to the audience. Identify the 2 symbols. Any answers?
None, Dr. Jyoti.
The first is the biohazard symbol for any biomedical waste in hospital. This is the symbol that will be carried on the receptacle of waste. And this is the cytotoxic hazard symbol for all waste that are contaminated by chemotherapeutic agents. So the cytotoxic waste can be divided into 2 broad categories. One is the personal protective equipment, which includes all the protective gear and clothes, that gown that one would use, and the chemotherapy equipment, which will include the vials, the fluid bottles, syringes, and sharps that are contaminated with chemotherapy. The question to the floor is, among the 5 receptacles that have been demonstrated here, which one would be ideal for discarding PPE versus chemotherapy equipment? Any answers?
No answers.
So both the PPE and cytotoxic waste will be combinedly disposed in this particular receptacle, which carries the symbol of a biohazard as well as a cytotoxic drug. So everything goes into this except sharps. Sharps can be discarded into the white container, but the cytotoxic drug contaminated sharps preferably should be in a different container. So the last case study for today's session is a 2-year-old boy, newly diagnosed case of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, has received the first dose of donomycin. The mother asks us as to why his urine has stained orange, and where she needs to dispose the diaper. Any answers?
Yeah, it has to be deposited in the cytotoxic chamber, is what they've said.
Right, that's the right answer. The answer to the first question, I'm sure all of us know, but that was not the purpose of putting this question in this case. I'd like to highlight that this is another important error that we all commit, and that is not informing the parents of the side effects that they need to anticipate. This will lead to unnecessary anxiety and difficulty in handling parents. So, like I said, the most important step in chemotherapy administration is patient information. That is the first error in this case. And yes, disposal of diapers is something we hardly pay attention to. There are guidelines for safe disposal of both cytotoxic waste and excreta of children who are on chemotherapeutic agents. This aims to ensure safety of all patients and caregivers. It states that all cytotoxic waste has to go into the cytotoxic waste container, and sharps preferably in a separate white container. Cloth gowns will go to the laundry just like any other material, but has to go separately in a separate container and has to be washed separately. So disposal of human waste while on chemotherapy, this is something we hardly pay attention to while taking care of activities in the ward. We need to remember that chemotherapy is excreted in both urine, stool and body fluids for a total duration of 48 hours and a maximum of about 7 days. When parents are handling children, especially their excreta, their diapers, they need to be told to wear non-sterile gloves while handling these. In the hospital, they need to dispose this in a cytotoxic hazard container, but this container is not going to be around the regular receptacles for waste. It will be placed in the washroom meant for patients' use and not with the general cytotoxic waste. At home, as they do not have access to cytotoxic hazard containers, it is preferable that they double bag every diaper in a plastic bag. It needs to be double bagged and discarded along with the household waste. And when a child uses the toilet, he has to flush the toilet with the lid down, and it always has to be a double flush to prevent contamination and cytotoxicity to the caregivers who are also going to use the same toilet. Any soil bedding has to be double washed in a separately from the other items in the house. And coming to the last slide and the last part of chemotherapy charting is monitoring for errors during chemotherapy charting. Most units around the world would always try to do some quality improvement initiative only after some fatality occurs in the ward as a knee-jerk response. This is far from ideal, and we need to make sure that the system is in place to allow for reporting of incidents and near misses. Every error in the process of chemotherapy charting has to be documented so that regular audits can identify error-prone areas, and we can call for processes or innovations that require modification. The classic example of innovations in this direction is the intrathecal vincristine causing fatal paralysis. Several units have begun using infusion bags of vincristine instead of syringes, like they piggyback it into the IV fluids. Units also use warning labels which are written in bold letters stating that vincristine not for intrathecal use. So every vincristine bag or vial goes with this warning label. Also, separate delivery and separate storage of intrathecal agents, which I previously mentioned during the discussion on dispensing, is also one of the innovations that was made to prevent errors due to intrathecal vincristine. So I'd like to end today's presentation with this slide. This is adapted from the United States Military Corps, which says to err is human, to forgive is divine, and neither is a Marine Corps policy. So I'd like to state that neither is a Cancer Corps policy as well. So say no to medication errors in the clinical oncology setting. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti and Dr. Pooja, for this talk. This has definitely been very informative and a very apt presentation. It has almost covered all aspects of chemotherapy charting. Though it's a very basic topic, I know it's a very important topic for all of us in clinical practice. So I definitely believe that all of us have learned something from this presentation. I thank you both again for taking the time out and preparing this presentation for all of us.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. If
Thank you.
anybody else has any questions, they can still post in the chat box. We can still take some questions.
And no questions, but a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jyoti, Dr. Pooja. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Bye. Bye.